Morning, I'm Anvar Varadaraj and I work in ELGi's Marketing and Communications Department. And today I have with me my father and CEO of ELGi, Dr. Jairam Varadaraj. So today hopefully I'll be asking him some tough questions that will give us some insight into business from the context of ELGi and his experience. So welcome today.
Thank you.
I want
Good
to start.
be with you. I don't get to spend enough time with you.
I know that's because you keep me working all the time, so that's the challenge, right? But anyway, I wanna start at the beginning. So you went to the University of Michigan, did your PhD. So what made you leave this glamorous career in academia to come run at that time a podunk compressor company in a one-horse town, Coimbatore?
I think it's multiple things. One was my thesis itself. My thesis was to understand why Indian companies are not competitive worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
It was a bit of a strange question to ask because that period was very strange because a protected market. Everybody conducted business in India with license and quotas. So the real thought of saying, why should I compete worldwide was never in anyone's frame of reference. So my curiosity came from the Japanese companies and then subsequently the Korean companies, all starting roughly in the same period. Japanese companies after World War II, Korean companies after the Korean War in the 50s, and Indian companies after 1947. So time frame same, source of technology, everyone went to the same European American companies to build the technology, buy technology. Companies from these two countries went ahead, became global, but we didn't. So that was my curiosity. So when came here, met different CEOs of various companies, did my own research, perspectives from my professors, I came to a belief that the problem is not so much the Indian environment. It was problem of defining your aspiration in terms of saying what you really want to be. Do you want to grow width-wise or do you want to go depth-wise? The choice was made breadth-wise because it was easy. You got licenses for different businesses, so you went breadth-wise. But to go depth required deep introspection, competence that had to be global. So this was more a easier proposition. So I believe that even though this was easier, the opportunity here was huge, right? So I think in my dissertation there is a table which you can pick up and see. There was a company called Ideal Java. They were making two-wheelers.
It's a Czech bike company.
No, but it's an Indian company making two-wheelers. They were producing 15,000 two-wheelers a year. The same time, Honda Motor Company was making 600,000 in one factory. So the scale just didn't make any sense. I mean, so if you go deep, the opportunity is much bigger than. So that was my presentation, that you had to go back in it. So call it putting your foot in your mouth. So I said, okay, if that's what you think, come here and prove it. The other options were to join either a consulting company or I didn't want to be a professor because the research programs that were expected of me were too theoretical. It was not practical and I couldn't see myself doing it for the rest of my life. So I said, okay, here is your point of view. Fulfill that point of view. Come home. There is a real platform, which is the family business. Try and transform it. So that's the choice I made.
I think really interesting to hear that your reflection process as you decided to come back to India. But I want to kind of stay in the realm of academia because at the time that you decided to come back to India, most of your experience was in academia and you didn't have work experience. So, what were some governing principles from academia that you brought to ELGi during your first entry?
I think the most critical central point that I brought back, and I need to give you a context for it. In those days, Indian companies were all diversified because of licensing restrictions. They really didn't grow big in one business or go deep in one business. So once a license capacity was used up, they went horizontal into multiple businesses. What happens when you straddle multiple businesses is that your competencies, your ability to develop competencies at a very deep level gets compromised. So what I observed as part of my research as well as reflection during my academic career is you look at companies that have spread themselves very thin in terms of competencies. So the central thing that I brought back is we need focus. Focus on a few things that we can be really good at, right? So that was a key lesson that I brought back.
The aspect that kind of stays with me here is that you almost started with an aspiration or a very ambitious challenge to understand why Indian companies were not becoming global. And was there a jarring moment when you came back to India and you perhaps noticed the amount of change required? We've often talked about the inefficiency, the being spread thin of resources. Talk me a little bit through your realization of what you found when you first got here.
I think the enormity of the change that was required was not something that I got surprised by. Having lived here, did my undergraduate education here, I knew it was culturally and socially, economically, I knew the context of India, right? So it was not a big surprise. But at a granular level and at the fundamental level, the number of dimensions that have to be changed, that was a discovery process, right? But I knew it was enormous. But it's like seeing a huge dense forest, and you knew the forest is there, but to discover every tree and discover the nuances of every tree and what needs to be done there was a bit overwhelming. And as you grow, you keep discovering this. But once you're on the path, you're there. You keep going. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure one very big tree was your father and my grandfather. So here you are with this idealistic plan and aspiration for the company, and he has his own experience and context. So how were you able to influence change?
Well, there are multiple levels. One was, fortunately for me, my father was not somebody who was new to doing business outside the country. But it was like for him, the international business is a nice appendage to the domestic business. And the change that I wanted to bring was exactly the opposite, that India becomes a nice appendage to a global business, right? So the transformation that I had to make on one level was easy because he was internationally oriented, he understood the dimensions of international business. But to create the resources and invest into resources that were required to change took a little bit of learning on his part, and all credit to him, he was open to it. And it required a lot of learning on my part to be able to present the plan to him in a manner that he could understand where the risks are and how those risks can be mitigated. And still, at the end, the company would be in a lot better shape, in a lot better place than where it was at that time. So it was a journey of conversations with him.
You've often spoke about how you actually took a lot of conscious decisions to close a lot of profitable businesses at that time. Now, I can't imagine that decision was managed or accepted easily. So, please elaborate on that. How were you able to push that through?
Like I said earlier, businesses in India were horizontally diversified. So there were multiple businesses in LG, each one demanding resources, both in terms of technology, people, capital. Uh, to convert this from an India-centric to a globally centric business, we had to put a lot of resources in place. Now, which meant that the resources were limited, and we had to focus those resources on a select set of businesses rather than across all. Now, my father is a child of the licensing regime, where businesses ran on a licensing principle, and horizontal diversification was the norm. And to convince him, I had to work with a lot of facts and numbers. We shut down a business which had an 80% market share and a 40% profit margin. And I had to demonstrate to him that the technology, the challenges of the future are going to be immense. Fortunately, in the early 90s, when India, we had the crisis in India, we had to take our gold and deposit it in Switzerland as part of our, resuscitating the country. And fallout of that was that India had to open up, had to integrate itself with the rest of the world. Now, when the doors opened from a protected economy, it was very evident that all the large multinationals were going to rush into the market. And we had these diversified set of businesses, none of which we had competencies that were world class. And we were going to get taken over. The markets are going to get taken over, but by these. And I had to make him see that. And the opening up of the economy made my job that much more easier because he could recognize it. So therefore, we had to decide that we had to shut down, sell off businesses, make very coherent choices in our portfolio. So again, it's not something that you just do in one Hanuman leap. I mean, you have a lot of conversations, you work with a lot of facts, data, you put it together, and then you present a coherent plan. And credit to him, he was able to see that.
Again, kind of staying in the realm of influence. My grandfather did have a context, but what about the down the line managers and the people that you worked with every day who didn't have that sophistication, and all they perhaps saw was someone new coming into the business and speaking a language that was completely different, and perhaps asking them to do a lot of things that was very uncomfortable. So what was your process to be able to change some of those steeped minds?
I think that process has not stopped. It's still continuing. When you are, for me, this is it's synonymous to a battle. There is a fort. As a leader, you're standing on top of the fort. Your troops are behind inside. You are seeing the enemy. They don't get a chance to see the enemy in its entirety. And you need to describe to them the enemy, right? You can describe the enemy in physical terms, but you can't describe the enemy in terms of competencies, right? So that is something that you experience, right? So it's like the writing is on the wall, but the reader has to read it, right? So it was a long process of getting people exposed internationally. Again, you can't do everybody at the same time. You take the key people, expose them, get them to understand what the reality outside the country is, and therefore understand what the gaps are between what the reality there is and what was our ground reality. Understand the gaps and then say, okay, we have a challenge here, right? And connect with that and get people to connect with it. So it's a lot of conversations, lot of data, a lot of exposure. Initially, it's all about preparing people to first understand the gap. If you don't understand and recognize and accept the gap, you're not going to be able to change, right? Then you're doing it because someone else is asking you to do it, not because you fundamentally believe. So the challenge was to get people to fundamentally believe there was a problem, right? And there is a huge gap. And again, it is not something that you can do it overnight. You need to work through that whole process. And we're still doing it. It's not over.
So we're here at a point at ELGi in your description of your entry into the company where you've helped showcase a vision of the future that's a little bit more focused, the importance of becoming global, the threats of the economy opening up to global competitors. So you have a little bit of a direction for the company and you have a way to get people on board. But now you foresee a lot of executional challenges. So as a leader, how do you prioritize those challenges and set goals that help move things forward?
I think when you're trying to change your company from one fundamental realm to another substantially different realm, you need to focus first on the foundations. Now, the foundations are what does the customer want and how can we deliver that most effectively. Now, the context for that is what is the global standard, right? So you understand the global standard and then say, where are you against that in terms of the foundation of the company? So you will have to look at technology. You got to look at your manufacturing processes, your quality standards, your ability, your service capabilities. These are foundational, right? So in terms of prioritizing what you need to focus on, when you have this global aspiration, is first build that foundation in place, right? You cannot go and try and do business all over the world with very archaic technology, shoddy products. Your delivery lead times are not competitive. So those are foundational. So the first part of the journey was to set those things in place, right? And now the next would be to say, okay, now you've got the foundations in place. The world is huge. Now, where do you play? You can't boil the ocean. You've got to focus on what you want to do. So that's the next segment of the journey where you decide on which are the markets you want to focus on, which are the customers you want to focus on, which are the products you want to focus on, build it up to a certain standard, and then you move on in your journey.
You've mentioned process as one of the foundations and having sound processes. But when does a business or an area of business, when can it accommodate process? Because if you're looking at the early days of a business and you're trying to understand the direction, does process perhaps take away from the agility of what you want to do?
I mean, process is fundamentally the purpose of process is to have repeatability in your quality.
Sure.
And when I say quality, it's not about quality of the products alone. It's about the quality of everything that the organization does, whether it is a payroll or whether it is inverting a material or whether it is supplying a product to the customer. These are all quality. Now, a process is to ensure that there is stability in what you do, right? Now, when you're trying to transform the company, first you need to decide what you want to do, right? So process is about putting an envelope on top of having designed what you want to do, right? So to answer your question, during the initial phase of the transformation, process is not the priority.
Okay.
Getting the fundamentals right? For instance, technology. If you take technology, you had to build the products. You had to design the products to world-class standards, right? Then you put a process of saying, how do I continue to design products that will continue to be world-class, right? So if I have to make a choice, first is the transformation, second is the process. Yeah.
Now we're at a stage where we're almost 25 years hence since that initial period, if not more. What did you decide at that point that LG would stand for?
Yeah, that was actually the journey started in 1994. Yeah. There is you don't wake up one fine day and then decide this is my moment and this is my vision, right? You go around meeting customers, you meet competitors, you understand what makes the market work, right? And then you decide, then you identified which part of the need of the market is least fulfilled, right? So that's one part of it. That's identifying the opportunity. Now, in a mature market like this, those opportunities are not so big. It's not like a cell phone technology or the high-tech new information technology where opportunities are quite big and visible, right? We are in a very stable business, right? So the opportunities are very niche. The second part of it is we are an unknown brand and we have a made in India label, right? So we need something that is, the value proposition should be far more compelling than what the rest of the established players give to the customer. So for us to define that takes time. You need to identify. For me, a classic differentiation is the stated need of a customer versus the unstated want of a customer. Yeah?
Okay.
A stated need is you go to the market, you ask a customer, how do you buy a compressor? And the customer will pretty much reel out, this is the basis on which I buy. So that's the stated need. But there are things that the customer accepts as a fate.
Okay.
To give you an example, when cell phones were all operated by buttons, you go to a customer and say, on what basis do I have? I'd like a bigger button. The buttons are too small. That's a stated need. But you can't expect a customer to say, I want a touch screen at that point in time. That's an unstated want. It's a pain point that for which a customer believes, this is my fate. I mean, this is the fate of technology. There's no change possible. Discovering the unstated want of a customer is really that compelling value of the future, right? And that requires a deeper understanding of what is the customer's pain point rather than the customer's stated want. Yeah? So you discover both these tracks and then say, in order for me to get to a certain right to play,
Sure.
is being the best in the stated want. Yeah. The right to win comes from the unstated need of the customer. Delivering the unstated need, then you have the right to win. Because to start with, you're an unknown brand and you're a made in India label. You've got to have a much more compelling value. And that comes from the unstated want of the customer. So for us to define that took a long time, right? So to come back and say, what is it that LG had to stand for is to be a company that was in the cutting edge of innovation, that constantly explores customers' pain points and bring value to the customer. That's one piece as far as the technology, what LG should stand for and what we envisioned LG's future is, right? The second piece is, again, deriving from the unknown brand and a made in India label. If a factory manager buys a multinational company's compressor and something goes wrong, he's not going to lose his job.
Yeah, he's not going to be faulted.
No. But if he buys an LG compressor and it fails, there's a potential for him to lose his job. So which means the quality of our products is just not good enough to be as good as the best. We have to be far better. Failure is something that we just cannot tolerate. because of the position, the brand position and the position of the company. So the quality, the standard of definition of quality was, the current standard was just not good enough. We had to aspire for. The third piece is really from a customer's point of view, any mechanical equipment will fail.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a life cycle failure, right? So it's a question of how quickly and effectively you respond to customers, right? And how quickly and effectively you engage with a customer with the intent for him to continue to derive value from your machine, even though it's gone down, right? How quickly can you do that, right? So to just give you an example, we have an unstated rule in the company: we will not argue with the customer. Yeah, we will first get the machine up and running and figure out the commercials later, right? That's the priority, right?
Sure.
That's the service experience. So we have been doing this effectively all over the world, and that's a foundation for us. Yeah. So these are all the priorities that we built out in the initial customer-oriented priorities.
So we've covered your entry into the business, spoken a little bit about your governing principles, about process and how we serve the customer and how that can be a source for a certain level of competitive advantage, and also the aspirations. What does it mean to build LG out as a global business? But a key component of this is people, right? So how do you bring people on board with you to help you execute against this?
I think at the end of the day, whatever your aspiration are and whatever is the roadmap to your aspiration that you build out is about people delivering that, right? Now, you can have people, you can have process, but the question is, at the end of the day, if you want to build a company that's at the knife's edge of excellence, right? People have to be at that level. Now, you got to step back and reflect what makes people do that, right? Now, in the final analysis, right, a person goes to work to make a living, to live. Now, if the work doesn't give the challenges at an emotional level, a challenge to be able to make a difference, there's no incentive for somebody to come and put his heart into it.
You're a zombie.
Yes, it becomes a mechanical process. The other thing is, if I do that, right, there should be a reward, not so much to have a great lifestyle, but it's just the recognition that I've done it and I feel I belong here. And so the whole idea of equity and sharing your wealth is so foundational to building the people envelope around the company, right? All the more so in India, where inequity is very high. Yeah?
Very visible.
Very visible, and it's widening, and nobody is really actively managing it, right? So we follow certain principles in LG in terms of equity, right? One example would be, we have a limit, multiple limit, between what the lowest guy gets and what the highest guy gets. We will never violate that multiple. Now, therefore, as a CEO, if I think I'm worth more and I want to earn more, I got to find ways for the people at the bottom to earn more, so that multiple enables me to earn more, right? So how do you go and manage the principle of that, right? How do you get people to earn more? It's very easy to just go and double salaries, triple salaries at the bottom, and therefore I get my multiple. Disaster. It's a perfect recipe for bankruptcy. So how do you build more value of the work that people do at the bottom, right? And it works its way up. A lot of times, compensation is viewed from the top down. In LG, we work it from the bottom up. So we are very conscious of what people earn at the bottom, right? The second aspect of it of equity is, there are two types of employees in any company. Employees that don't have a choice, invariably the blue-collar employees. they have very little choice of employment outside the company. The white-collar employees have the option of going, they don't like the environment, they don't like the compensation, they can go and get a job elsewhere. Now, we have to segment employees and cater to their specific requirements. So a blue-collar employee will always have very high levels of insecurity, right? And there is always an inherent feeling that, am I going to get left behind, right?
Sure.
And if I don't argue and make my presence felt, I may not be considered. So what we do is, the blue-collar employee is the lowest level of employee. We flip the whole equation out and say the person with the lowest voice will be heard the highest in the company. So our process today is about saying, I want you to speak and I want you to speak loudly, and I promise you that I will hear it the most, right, and respond to it, right? So on the white collar, it's about, the market, of course, in India is all about, driven by instant nirvana. I want it today and I want it immediate, right? So that's become the social fabric. But to build an organization that's going to be world-class, you need tenure of people. You can't just have people revolving around like a merry-go-round, right? So how do you build tenure for white-collar employees in an environment where this constant rotation is the norm rather than the exception, right? So excitement in the job, learning opportunities in the job, further education on the job, higher challenging jobs, and of course, be the best in compensation, right? So these are all the elements that we are working on. And I hope that, and the equity piece is very important. So, senior leadership to the lowest level, there will be an equity in terms of their compensation. So I think these are elements of pieces that we put together in the whole larger envelope of people management. Yeah.
Speaking of your own leadership journey, what was your process in your early days to identify your strengths and opportunities as it related to business, in terms of how you interacted with people and in terms of how you influenced people?
I think to establish leadership credibility, there has to be consistency in what you say. Yeah, you can't be inconsistent. You can't say one thing one day and change the direction for the company the next day. So consistency is key. The second is, all that you do should be aligned to that purpose, right? So you can't say that I'm going to be, you're going to build out this great technology, and then when it comes to actually investing money into taking that risk to develop it, as an example, you step back and say, no, let's not do that. So there's an inconsistency, right? So consistency and backing up that consistency with resources, right, is a true display of saying, I want to go here and I will stay committed to going there, right? So that is foundational for leadership, right? So people see a certain consistency. They don't feel dislocated. They feel that there is a purpose to this whole thing, and they follow you, right?
As you reflect on yourself as a leader, as in you specifically, what did you identify early on were your strengths in terms of managing people, and what were challenges that were inherent to you, the way you approached people or your character, that could have been a stumbling block in business?
Naturally, I'm a very aggressive person, right? So sometimes that aggression can be misconstrued as something that I don't like people.
Okay.
Yeah? So you could get tempted to become a nice person, yeah. But if you try and win a popularity contest, you will lose the leadership contest.
Sure.
Right? So the job is not to be popular, right? But the job is to be fair, right? I mean, you can be aggressive, but you can be fair.
Sure.
So people may not like the way you speak. People may not like the way, as long as you don't get personal and you're fair in your expression and your commitment to people, eventually they fall in line. Initially they don't like you, yeah, because you say it like it is and you're very aggressive. They don't like you. But as long as there is a fairness to the whole thing, over a period, people forgive you for your aggression.
Aggression.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about talent in this context. For example, you have 3 children. One of them is clearly more talented than the other two, right? You're obviously going to reward him and recognize him in a different way. Equity there can be a little bit of a stumbling block. But again, on a more serious note, we have this aspiration to be number 2, right? And getting us there is going to be on the backs of some very talented people. I'm talking about business rock stars, whether it's with technology, whether it's with marketing, sales, across multiple dimensions. How do you create a culture in the company that A, recognizes excellence, and B, rewards it, so that you have those people who are willing to stay in their careers long term? Because talented people are attractive people to other entities, so that's where you have the biggest risk of attrition. So A, how do you recognize them, and B, how do you retain them?
Well, first of all, on a lighter note, I'm thrilled with your humility that you accept Varun as very competent. So, having answered that question and put that to rest in terms of who's going to get compensated more, I think there is a belief that talent is about having these mavericks running around in a company and creating magic. That's a company. It's not an institution, right? The goal with ELGi and its aspiration is about building an institution. Yeah, an institution survives for long periods of time. It sustains its excellence over a long period of time. And if you benchmark institutions that come to your mind, whether it is a university or whether it is a company or whether it's a non-profit organization, you will never hear of maverick leaders or set of maverick people who made those institutions what they are or sustain those institutions for what they are. But you hear about companies which are short-lived. You will hear about these mavericks who've created these phenomenal companies that just burst, right? So,
just to stop you there for just a second, can you give me an example of a company that you believe is an institution, sort of in a unglamorous space, as you will, as a mature market?
I think there are a lot of institutions that are there. GE would be an example of an institution that has sustained itself over many years, changed and responded. But more than a company, I would take, let's say, take in the university context.
Sure.
You take a Harvard or an Oxford or a Stanford or a Cambridge. These are all institutions of excellence that have gone on for hundreds of years. But there are no one maverick that you can say this maverick created that. Yeah. Sure, there is somebody who initiated these institutions. Maybe you go back and read the history, there could be one maverick who really initiated them. But sustenance is not about mavericks. Yeah, it's about ordinary people doing extraordinary types of work. Yeah. And that's the context of the company, not the context of the individual, right? And if you look at talent, you go to a school. When you went to school, not everybody got the same grades.
Yeah.
Right from your childhood all the way to your end of life, there is always relative performance. in every part of walk of your life, yeah, whether even within family, right? I just told you Varun is better than you, right? So it's relative performance, yeah. So even in a company, you cannot have a socialistic view of people. Everybody is equal. You can't do that. There are talented people, but there are also solid citizens. Yeah, you can't have just talented people and no solid citizens, right? So you have different ways of dealing with people. But it's again conversations, right? If a person who's a solid citizen has a misconceived notion of his own capability, you have to have a conversation and say, this is what you are, this is who you are, and this is why you are what you are, right? So expectations are stabilized, right? Same thing with talented people. You've got to go and tell them you are talented. And we will embrace you, we will recognize you, we will fast track you, we will move you. But how to do all this in a very equitable, transparent, fair manner? That's really the challenge of talent management, right? And we are going through these challenges in our company. Yeah? So we have some idea who our talented are, but we don't have a lot of very clear process by which we can say we are reasonably sure these are our top talent. We're reasonably sure these are our solid citizens, right? So, but it's a journey. It's not something that there is a mathematical model that you can pick and adapt in your company. It's a process of discovery, right? But it's an important part of the process of discovery. Without that, you're really not going to build an institution, because institution requires highly talented people along with solid citizens.
I want to spend a little bit of time on the recognition and fostering of talent. You've spoken in the past about how it's really the responsibility of the manager, right? Now, managers come in all forms and shapes and sizes and experience. You have engineers, you have marketing managers, etc. So, what are some basic guiding principles that any manager today can use to be able to recognize and motivate talent that's independent of HR or a reliance on HR?
You know, people management responsibility belongs to every leader. Anybody who has somebody reporting to him has people management responsibility. It cannot be devolved to the HR organization. HR organization facilitates with process. It's the guy who's actually managing people who has to take responsibility for that person's future. Right? Now, having said that, that's a very utopian kind of expression. The reality is far away from that, right? Especially in India, people don't seem to think that as a manager's primary responsibility is the responsibility to his people, right? If they do the job, he gets his job done, right? So we have a challenge here. I don't think there are very clear answers. Again, it's a process of evolution. It's a process of change that has to happen within ELGi. The bad thing is we are not there yet. But the good thing is most other companies are also not there yet. So we are kind of in a joint journey to discover this. Yeah.
What are things that managers can start doing today to start this process of talent management?
You know, it's like asking a teacher, what should I do? What should you do to grade differently? Teacher's job is that, to teach and grade and test, right? Now, you can't go and ask the teacher, how can you put different grades, right? It's the same thing to the manager. You're teaching your people to do the job. They actually go out and do the job, and he has to evaluate them and give them feedback, right? This is not rocket science. This is the basic process, right? So somewhere along the line, even the basic processes at a fundamental level are broken, right? Are not being pursued. Again, it's why do all this? Just talk to the guy, adjust, change, do this, have conversation, finish it, and appraisals are over, get on with next year, right? The whole process of engagement has to change, and it's a struggle. We don't have a clear solution for this, but we are conscious that we don't have it. So it's a conscious.
It needs to start from there.
It's a conscious ignorance. It's not an unconscious ignorance.
So we're better off in a
Slightly better off. That's all. I mean, we're not in any great shape, but we're getting there. We will get there. Yeah.
We have this aspiration, number 2 in the world, and we're in a unique space because all of our competition is European, American. They come with certain embedded advantages of their country of origin. But before we go too specifically into our competition, how should a leader think about competition?
Well, competition is an opportunity. Yeah. And a challenge, right? Now, the space for you to compete is given by the inability of the competition. If the competition is absolutely perfect, there is no space for you, right? So you need to look at where is the competition weak? What are the opportunities for you? I spoke a little bit about it in the context of saying a customer stated need and an unstated want. Now, if you have a competitor who is fully conversant and engaged on both these dimensions and delivering systematically and consistently on both these dimensions, I think you should exit that market because there is no room to play. But it's exactly the gaps in the fulfillment of these two by a competitor is your opportunity, right? So viewing the competition with high levels of respect is a starting point, but also not succumbing to the overwhelming size of the competitor and saying, gosh, they're so big, and what is it that we can do, could make you flat-footed and look at it as there is no opportunity, when in reality that could be, yeah? So it's the David and Goliath story. Yeah? Just because you're big doesn't mean you're going to win all the time, yeah? And for David is to recognize where the weaknesses are, yeah? And for me, the most relevant example or story is our own independence.
Yeah.
The British had money, they controlled the police, they controlled the army, they controlled the treasury, they had everything. They had all the money. They are like the biggest competitor that you go and see in the market. What we had was aspiration, freedom, very powerful aspiration, right? That aspiration made us win. So the question that you need to ask is, do you have that aspiration and is there an opportunity? It's a combination of two. If you don't recognize opportunity, just having an aspiration, you're going to fall flat on your face. Yeah? You recognize that opportunity and combine it with aspiration. You need to then look at your competition through the lens of both. Yeah?
We've now gotten into aspiration. Obviously, a big buzzword at ELGi right now. It's governing everything that we do.
Yeah.
But you talked about India and you talked about competition, and many a time they're the ones who have the resources. But how does having an aspiration and a powerful, justified, reasonable aspiration compensate for lack of resources that you may have?
I think we need to understand that nobody was born big. They were made big, right? And in the journey of becoming big, they didn't make one big Hanuman leap and became big, right? So, if you look at the end goal and then say, that's my aspiration, for that aspiration I don't have the resource now, is based on the assumption that you're going to make one big Hanuman leap and get there. You chart your trajectory, right, towards that goal. At every stage in the trajectory, you're not starved of resources. You may be starved of looking at it from one point, right, at the end point.
It's intimidating.
That could be intimidating. But, you know, when a marathon runner starts off running, he doesn't visualize the 40th kilometer. He visualizes the next 1 kilometer, right? So, do I have the pace and stamina to finish that 1 kilometer? Then it's the next, and it's the next. But if he's going to keep looking at that 40th kilometer finish and get despondent, oh, I'm only in the 3rd kilometer, he's not going to make it. It's not that he doesn't have the stamina. It doesn't mean it doesn't have the capability. It is about how you view your aspiration and how do you moderate it into a trajectory that is reasonable. So, in that trajectory, you don't have resource constraints. You have aspiration constraints. But if you have the aspiration, resource is not a constraint. Yeah.
Interesting. So, what's the relationship between aspiration and strategy?
Well, the aspiration is the larger vision of what you want to become. Yeah. Strategy is these milestones, the trajectory to get there. You know. So, if we want to be number 2, now we're not going to become number 2 by just a statement of that. It needs to get converted into granular action plans. Right? Now, those granular action plans, one could call is a strategy of the company. Now, effectively, it means you need to define where you want to play, and you need to define how you're going to win in where you want to play, given the larger competitive context, your own company context, and say how, and the customer's context. Put these 3 together and then say, how am I going to win in this place that I've chosen to play, right? Now, this is not rocket science. This is, if you go talk to anybody, this is probably strategy 101. You know, you pick it up, you'll say, this is what you do. But I think the fundamental issue and the fundamental ingredient of a successful strategy is discriminating investments where disproportionate resources are committed to the direction you've chosen. Yeah. You know, if you want to get off and go somewhere, you've got to get off and go somewhere, right? Now, it's like, for me, a favorite analogy is that I'm going to go to Chennai and I'm going to walk. But you get on a treadmill and you walk vigorously, right? You'll huff and you'll puff and you'll do everything, expend energy, not getting anywhere. Right? So you've got to get off the treadmill and find the path, right? Now, that means you need to go and put your resources where it'll get you there, right? You put your resources on the treadmill, which is your comfort zone, and it is just routine, not going anywhere. Yeah. So the aspiration is the larger envelope. Strategy 101 tells you where to play and how to win. But the real challenge is to take your resources, and when I say resources, your most talented people, your money, your competence, and disproportionately put it where you want to go play and win. That's the risk. Invariably, in most companies, the seduction of routine is so high, you tend to spread your risks evenly, right? Take your resources and let me also hedge my bet here, let me hedge my bet there, let me hedge my bet here, right? make sure that I don't tilt the boat. That's not strategy. Even though you've made choices, this is where I'm going to play, this is how I'm going to win, but it's evenly spread. Yeah, you're not going to move forward. You'll have an aspiration, you'll have a strategy, no result. Yeah. So for me, strategy is about all of those stacked together. Yeah, and delivering. Yeah.
You talked about how to win being a component of strategy. Now, bringing us back to LG and our competitive space,
Yeah.
right? We have impressive competitors,
Yep.
fantastic technology, fantastic brands, fantastic processes, right? Truly global businesses. And again, going back to what we discussed earlier, coming with the embedded advantage of country of origin, being European, American, etc. So, how do we use brand as right now it's a seeming disadvantage. We have the negative connotations of being an Indian company and the quality implications that come with it. But how do we move into that honestly becoming a competitive advantage for us?
Yeah, this is our starting point. Our starting point is not the one that we prefer to be in, but that's the reality. So it's a given. Yeah. But I don't think it's an insurmountable given. There is enough lessons in history uh, that that are exemplary brand journeys, starting from where we are starting now, but ending up to be the best in the world. Right. One classic example that everyone talks about is Toyota. Right. Now, when the Japanese cars were entering in the US in the late 70s, cars were not respected. They were considered cheap cars, cheap, and it is made in Japan. I remember when I was a child, when my father bought me a toy which said made in Japan, I used to think that he has done me a huge injustice. Yeah.
And now it's all made in China.
Sure, but today made in Japan has a different characteristic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So you look at that brand evolution, right? They started where we are starting, but they've reached, now Toyota's number 2. I mean, they were number 1. I think in numbers, they've kind of dropped a little bit. But nobody will dispute the fact, if you want a reliable car, buy a Toyota, right?
True.
That's starting from a reputation of saying not reliable, cheap cars to this. And it's been a journey of about 30 odd years. Yeah. Now, will we be able to achieve that in 10 years? No. But in 35 years, Toyota grew from strength to strength to strength, right? What is that journey? What is that brand journey? It's not about advertising. For me, advertising is a communication of one small part of your company, which is your logo and your brand position. It's just communication. But brand for me is consistency and experience of everybody who touches your company, right? Not just the customer, the employee, the supplier. If you say this is what we are this great company, and the supplier is meant to wait for 2 hours before he gets his job done in the company, I think a very bad brand. If somebody calls your company and the phone doesn't get picked up, it's a very bad brand. You may have sponsored the IPL. Everybody knows LG, right? But they know LG for all the wrong reasons. Bad experience, right? So it's about managing every stakeholder's touch with the company. It doesn't have to be positive. It's about managing that experience. You may have a customer who's having a bad experience with your product. Bad experiences are part of life, but how you handle it is your brand. Yeah.
So it can actually end up adding to your brand equity.
Absolutely. A negative experience can add so much more to your brand than just a positive experience. It's how you handle it. It's how that customer and that stakeholder experiences you. Yeah. And it comes from fundamental genuineness. It's not about fancy process, brochures. Sure, those are important. Yeah. But they don't make brands. The genuineness of the company and all the people working in the company towards the stakeholders. That's the brand. So we need to build out brand on all these dimensions. Besides, of course, the brand positioning, the advertising, the social media management, all that stuff. But for me, those are all the veneer. The real strength is in the experience.
Staying in the context of India, right? And I think that whether you take manufactured products or services, the response that a global customer might have is, this is an Indian product, I can expect a discount. And I feel that that has been perpetuated by the suppliers to an extent where they say, we have an advantage of lower labor cost position, and hence we are able to service this lower price need. So there is a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle, right? The customer expects low price by virtue of Indian, and we kind of put up our hands and say, yes, we can offer it because our costs of production are lower. How do you respond to that when in the context of ELGi being an Indian company, and we frankly face some of the same expectations from customers? In terms of how do you respond to that, in terms of saying what's the future of that going to be? How do you evolve that perception?
I think you're in India, you come from India, customer expects you to be low cost.
Sure.
That's a given. If a customer wants to take a risk of buying a product from an unknown brand and a made in India label, it's in his every right to expect a return for that risk. And that return is in the form of a lower price. It's a given. That's fine. That's the dynamics of the business in the current context.
So we can't fight it.
I don't think it makes any sense. You can't even fight it, right? To go and say you're going to charge a premium for a product, it just doesn't make any sense. But there are two things that we need to work on. One, how much is your company dependent on cheap Indians?
Okay.
That, as a value of the company, is not acceptable. We don't want to build a strategy of ELGi. Everybody comes to work to improve their standard of living, right? Now, one aspect of standard of living is earning more. But if the strategy of the company is built on me earning less, it's a fundamental disconnect, right? So it's not sustainable. So we don't want to build ELGi on the back of Indians being cheap. We want to build ELGi in the context of Indians being as expensive as the most expensive in the world. Now, to do that, one, we need to look at how productive can we become, right? It's not about firing people, but it's about hiring less and doing more, right? The second is, how can you shift the technology to something that the value is to the customers so compelling, differentiatedly compelling from the competition. Therefore, you earn your money, right? So it's a combination of both these things. 1994, the delta between our blue-collar employee, and a European blue-collar employee was a delta of 60. 60. Yeah?
60.
Yeah. So, today, that delta is 4.
It's a big difference.
So, we have come a long way. And that's evidence to our commitment that we will continue to make Indians expensive and still be competitive, right? It's foundational to our values. Yeah.
How much of that is this journey towards making Indians more expensive? How much of that also relies on, from a production perspective, moving to more technology-driven production as opposed to labor-driven production? When I think about LG's journey, we are doing so much more with so much less, with far fewer people in India. And some of it is owing to process and some of it is owing to technology. So there's a struggle that I have there, in the sense that you have this population. So are you moving to an advantage of cheap Indians by using less or using fewer?
No, we are not using the advantage of cheap Indians. For us, as a company, we view cheap Indians as a window of an opportunity, and we are going to close it ourselves.
It's temporary.
We are going to close it ourselves. We are going to make the Indians working in LG expensive. Right? Now, to answer your question, we have so many Indians. We need to employ more of Indians. And if we employ more of Indians at that kind of a salary, we may not afford it. I think that's a very short-term view. Yeah. Employment should not be a goal. The value of employment
should be the goal.
Is the bigger goal, right? In the context of equity, I'm coming back to that equity issue. Employment creates inequity. Value of employment, if it's focused on, brings equity into the play. Yeah? And we will never be a developed nation if we are an inequitable nation. Yeah. I mean, that's a national development agenda, but in the context of LG, LG cannot be a global company if it has inequity. Yeah, it has to be equitable. Yeah.
What was foundational to this aspiration of making, or this goal of making Indians more expensive, is that it's a value, right? So why is it important for a company to have values or be value driven?
I think it starts with the principle of building an institution rather than a company. Yeah, a company, like I said, is short-lived. An institution is forever, right? Now, if the purpose of the company is to build wealth for its shareholders, there are so many opportunities by which you can do it.
Sure.
Some of them could be extremely criminal.
Sure.
Some of them on the other side, right? How you make money is as important as the making of the money itself. Yeah. Not the mechanics of the business, this product at this price. That's not the way of how. The envelope of conducting the business within the company, that envelope of that how is very important, right? In order for you to build an institution. Yeah. And it's also important, and it's also valuable in the long term. It's a profit. It's profitable to practice
be value driven.
Yes, in the long term. In the short term, it may look as an inconvenience. Yeah, but in the long term, those are the things that sustain your profits.
So let's imagine a young entrepreneur is early stages of his business, setting up his company. How does he choose his values?
I don't think it's a choice that is made at the top.
Okay.
If you look at the journey of how we defined our values, values are something that everybody believes in. It's not something that you thrust down the throat of an individual because it's chosen at the top in the boardroom. They have picked up these values that sound nice, and therefore we're going to. It is something that everybody should share.
Not right? From an outsourced HR process.
No. So for us to define our values took us 2 years. We went through multiple rounds of conversations with close to about 600 employees. And what they believed that LG stood for, and what they believe should be LG's considering LG's aspiration, what is it that LG should practice, right? So, the 7 values that we have identified is not something that I wished it were for the company. This was from the ground up, co-created by all the employees of the company.
So there's strong ownership at every level.
I wouldn't say that just because it's co-created, people own it, but it is definitely something that's the responsibility of creation came from the employees, right? So therefore, it's a little stronger in terms of its binding, you know.
There's one dimension of LG's value creation or value identification process that was a function of how people were already behaving and how they were interacting with each other. And you mentioned nearly 600 employees. But for a younger company, should those values be a reflection of what the company is or what it should be? Because at the early stages, the responsibility of a leader might arguably also be to say, these should be the values that I want the company to foster, assuming they're noble, right? Independent of the aspirations that we have, independent of the strategy. So, for someone who is in that position, how do they go about possibly selecting those values?
I don't know whether there is a dictionary of values that you can flip through and pick. Values are what you fundamentally believe in, right? Now, if I'm running a company and I don't attach too much importance to lubricating a sale,
Sure.
then you can't say integrity is a big value in our company. Then it's not something that you believe in. It looks good on the wallpaper.
Sure, sure.
Right. So the important thing for somebody is to say, fundamentally, what do I believe in? Yeah. And then pick, that is one part of it. The other part of it is values are good for business. So if this is my aspiration, what do I want people, how do I want people to behave in order to be successful here? Right? So it's both these things. What's the true belief and what's important for the business? So these 7 values that we have are foundationally critical for the business, for the success of the business. It's not something that we would like to fly a flag on.
Sure.
It's good for business. Yeah.
We've established the role for values and how they are fundamental to business as opposed to something that one must sort of pursue with a moral obligation. So let's dive a little bit into LG's values and what they mean to you. So let's start with, what does integrity mean for you at LG?
Well, the base definition of integrity is honesty, but that's a very small envelope, right? Integrity means it is, the classic example is, if something were to be written about me tomorrow in the newspaper, if I'm going to be ashamed of it, then my behavior has no integrity. If I'll be proud of it or neutral to it, I have integrity in my behavior. It could be stealing money, it could be talking behind somebody's back, or not telling somebody the truth, or telling somebody something that you don't believe in. All these are if they were published in the newspaper. Jairam Varadaraj said this about Anvar when in reality, this is what he believed, and that's going to make me feel ashamed, and there's no integrity in my behavior, right? So it's a very big envelope. Yeah.
How about sensitivity in LG's context?
Sensitivity is to understand a person's requirement before he states it. Yeah. After a person comes and says, this was my expectation. Now, it's not monetary.
Sure.
Right? It's about in the job. Yeah. Everybody is a supplier and a customer inside the company. Right? if I'm sensitive to my customer, and if I'm able to go extend myself and say, hey, if this is what he wants, I should be able to give it. The fundamental problem in our company, in the country, is when we buy things, we have very high standards. When we sell things, we lower our standard. We give excuses, right? So as a customer, you have very high standards. As a supplier, you lower it. It's the same person, correct? Bridging that is for me sensitivity. Right?
Interesting.
You bridge that. Behave like a customer when you're supplying. Sensitivity.
Why is speed a value at LG?
Speed is profits. People, you can actually create a balance sheet and profit and loss on time. Because if you look at any balance, it's a reflection of time. You take inventory, it's a reflection of time. Receivable, it's a reflection of time. Any cost is a reflection of time. I'll explain to you. If I have a design engineer and he has 3 months to complete a design, and we need 2 designs, right? We'll have to hire a second design engineer. But if I'm able to find a way to make the design in 1.5 months, then I don't hire the second design engineer, right? So there's profit. So whether you want to call it speed, speed is what we call it, but velocity is really about profits, right? So everything is about profits is about velocity, right? You take a sales guy who needs 10 calls to make an order, and he can do it in 5, he's made money for the company because he can get 2 orders. So people need to think about the velocity of their work. It's not about standing upside down and working, giving your life and work. You give your life and work, you give it once, right?
Sure.
That's not about it. It's about working smart and saying, how can I get rid of work that doesn't add value to the customer? How can I improve my processes? So it's about self-generation of your own ideas rather than waiting for somebody to come and tell you. That's speed.
Interesting, very interesting perspective of the linking of speed to profit. Does cost prudence have a similar link?
I think cost prudence, when somebody looks at it, it's about cost cutting. It's not about cost cutting. It's about spending money carefully. Yeah. Actually, cost prudence is about spending money carefully. It's not about cost cutting. Right? So, if you have a project to do, right, a supplier gives you a scope. You blindly accept that scope and pay. Or you break it down into minor detail and then say, is this really necessary for us? Can we postpone this?
Sure,
right?
sure.
Can we defer this expense? Right? That's about spending it the right way. It's spending less to get the same value. Right? It should not be confused by saying, it sounds like it's running contrary to our aspiration to make Indians expensive. No, it actually complements it. So you spend less to get the same value. Right? Therefore, you are cost prudent. Yeah?
Moving on next to collaboration. What does collaboration look like at LG?
A company is not one function. Company is a collectivity of functions coming together to deliver a value to a stakeholder. Right? Whether it is a supplier, or whether it is a distributor, whether it's a customer or an employee, all functions come together to deliver that value. There may be one front-ending function, but the fact is all of them are important to deliver that value, right? And that affects our brand too, because that stakeholder's experience with the company influences the brand. And therefore, if functions do not collaborate, the stakeholders' experience diminishes.
Mm.
And if it diminishes, it affects our business. So simple thing would be paying your suppliers' bills on time, right? The materials department may be front-ending the supplier, but the quality organization, the production organization, the finance organization, they all have to collaborate with that goal. If finance says, not my worry, supplier management is your concern,
Mm-hmm.
money is my concern.
Mm-hmm.
Now you got a problem. You've got created silos.
The disconnect.
To cut across these silos, functional silos, collaborative behavior is very critical because the goal, the larger goal, is more important than the functional goal. Yeah.
And similarly, innovation.
Innovation is almost a foundational value because if we want to, if our aspiration is to be number 2 in the world, and if we want to hit it in the timelines that we're talking about, we need to be fundamentally different. And it's not about just the product, it's not about just the technology. It is in everything that we do, right? How can we bring innovation? How can we think differently? How can we adopt technology? How can we bring in technology that's not been used? So it's constant thinking
It's a
about
mindset.
doing things better. Yeah.
And finally, about quality.
Quality, I've explained in throughout this conversation. It's something that has to be at such high levels
Mm-hmm.
in our company uh, to fuel our journey. This vehicle, which is an unknown brand and a made in India label, to fuel it, to put horsepower into it, quality is the biggest thing. So it's not again products, it's quality across the organization.
I think the fascinating thing about the run through of values is that it's linked to our strategy and also our aspiration. So, when one hears this discourse, one might assume, well, since it's so closely tied to their business goals and objectives, that it's a no brainer that they must be practiced all the time. Is that our experience?
Not at all. Values, behavior, there is no, you can't say that this is now, we are now conformed to values. The thing about values is it's always a horizon.
Mm-hmm.
It's never a destination. Yeah. You keep shifting, and as you keep shifting, the standards keep moving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you keep on. It's a long, permanent journey.
Hmm.
You will never say I've reached the limits of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
No, but you keep pushing it towards it.
We've had a very comprehensive discussion. We've talked about the early inception of ELGi, we talked about the genesis of aspiration, how strategy fits into aspiration, leadership and talent in the context of what we want to achieve, then finally our brand and our values. All of these culminate into us establishing an institution. But as part of the promoter group, how do we sustain the institution over time? Well, an institution by your definition has sustenance, but today you are a strong personality in the company and arguably driving a lot of the change. What does governance and ownership look like in the future? Or what should governance and ownership look like in the future? And what are some models that we should aspire to?
You're absolutely right. I mean, human life is finite, and finite human lives should combine together to create an infinite institution. Yeah. Now, how do you do that? Uh, because if you allow mavericks during their finite lifetime can destroy institutions, right? So the governance structure of the company is very important. Now, what I've found, or my theory, is good governance is a tripod. It has three strong legs. One is the management of the company. They should be given the freedom to explore mitigated, carefully managed risks.
Okay.
There should be promoters with skin in the game as integral part of the governance structure. Because there are enough examples of companies that have had great management, but nobody with skin in the game in the governance structure. So they went haywire. The inherent behavior of people with skin in the game, namely the promoters who are in the governance structure, their inherent behavior is risk averseness. So you have management and owners with causing that tension, right, between risk and risk averseness. Then the third leg are the critical leg of independent directors who manage this tension triangle. Yeah. So it becomes tightly, therefore it brings stability to the institution, right?
And it becomes a productive relationship.
It's a productive relationship because each one brings a perspective, and there is tension, which is constructive tension, but they are tied together, and because it's three legs, they've got stability, right? Two is unstable, right? And they are all tightly held together. Yeah? And that's really the ideal philosophy of governance. But to actually execute it is a lot of work, right?
So there's something inherent in your discussion of this interface between management and ownership, that the future setup, the owner should be divorced from management.
Absolutely.
And why is that important?
Ownership and management could cause a very toxic cocktail where violation of values are very easily possible. People tend to look at owners as owners, and if they do certain things,
It's excusable.
they tend to absolve them. So it's not a good structure.
One aspect of what you said that stands out is there are multiple dimensions to job satisfaction for the white collar employee. And tomorrow, as we continue along our journey to be number 2 in the world, our management or our leaders in the company that are responsible for getting our products sold successfully and create successful customer experiences will need to be at the forefront. And as fundamentally an engineering company, how does someone who is technically strong evolve into becoming a leader?
I think an individual is made up of two pieces. There is a domain expertise that an individual has, whether he's an engineer or whether he's an accountant or whether he's a sales and marketing guy, there is a domain expertise. Then there is the leadership expertise. Now, the domain expertise is something that you go and learn and pick up as part of your education, and then deployment of that education in a work context. You build that. The leadership piece is about partly development of that individual, but also a significant part of self-development. For me, a manager is a person who relies on his title to lead people. A leader is a person who doesn't need a title to lead people, right? There is a natural gravitation of people to a person,
leader.
right? And that's a true leader, right? And so you don't need a title. So you can take the the lowest level of employee who doesn't have anybody reporting to him, and he can still exhibit leadership capability because horizontally his peers will gravitate to him. And that's evidence of leadership, right? So, how does an individual work in a context, whether it is a for-profit company, whether it's in a government organization, it doesn't matter, right? So, it's leadership is about being there and saying, what do you do? How do you behave? So people naturally gravitate to you, right? And then you become a leader. Then leadership becomes easy, yeah?
How much of that do you believe is innate versus something that can be learned? Because we often meet people, who don't have the context and exposure that might build a leader, but they have that natural gravitas, they have that natural ability to pull people. But for people who aren't instinctually or naturally that way, is that something that can be learned?
I am not sure that people are born as leaders. I don't particularly believe that. But I also believe that some people naturally have certain characteristics that are more conducive for being a leader. It doesn't mean that such of those other people who are not naturally born that way cannot become, vibrant leaders. You take the leadership spectrum across all organizations, profit-making, government, you have all hues of people with different characteristics. So that gives me the faith that it's not just you're born with those innate characteristics and therefore you become a leader. You are a leader by virtue of the fact that you have put in the effort to become a natural leader of people, where people gravitate to you. Yeah.
So we've come to the end of our discussion today. I've thoroughly enjoyed asking these questions, so I appreciate you making the time. And I think the one thing that I can take away is that we definitely have a strong foundation. And I think that there have been a lot of things that have come out today that are applicable to institutions and companies at different forms of their growth and aspiration cycles. So again, I appreciate your time and I look forward to more of these discussions.
Thank you. And it was good to spend time with you. I don't get to do it very often at home.
So well, as long as you get a camera in front of me, I'll spend the whole day. So
okay, good.